And now I will recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After overseeing an attack on education funding, the Education Minister was unable to answer basic questions about departmental spending. The Minister cut reading recovery to save money, but couldn't tell us the cost of succeeding in reading. A little over an hour, Mr. Speaker, the Education Minister could not answer more than 20 questions about education department spending. So my question to the Premier, why is the Premier allowing a minister to stay in control of such a critical and important department when the minister is clearly unable to explain departmental spending?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid he's referring to questioning that took place in estimates, I believe. I know that in this House, whenever the Minister of Education is asked questions, she gives full and complete answers, and I can only assume that it was the quality of the questions.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Speaker, I'm sure parents across this province will find some comfort in the Premier's cavalier approach to cuts in public education. Mr. Speaker, the Official Opposition are not the only ones warning of the impact of government's repeated cuts. CUPE, the NSGU, the SEIU tell us there are fewer resources for students with behavioral and developmental issues. The NSTU, members of the Education Minister's profession, tell us that teachers have lost their jobs because of government's cuts. Mr. Speaker, CUPE, the NSGU, the NSTU are saying that the NDP government's decision are costing jobs and increasing class sizes and reducing supports to students. My question to the Premier, how can they all be wrong?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'm not sure what it is that he's referring to, but all I can tell him, which is the truth, is that the per capita funding for student has gone up dramatically. I have tabled in this House just how much it has gone up. The teacher-student ratio it has gone down. So, Mr. Speaker, there are 30,000 less students than 10 years ago. Mr. Speaker, and yet there are 300 more teachers. I think everybody understands what that means.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, last year there were 553 positions cut because of this government's attack on public education. There were 82 teaching positions, 136 specialists, 75 teaching assistants, Mr. Speaker, 132 support positions. Mr. Speaker, that was last year. Chignecto Regional School Board, Mr. Speaker, warned of job cuts. Halifax Regional School Board warned yesterday there will be job cuts coming next week. And school boards across this province have been warning since last November that the decision by this government to cut education further would mean there would be job losses of direct impact on students, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Premier, why is the Premier protecting and supporting a minister that is clearly so out of touch with reality in today's classroom?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, last year the school boards hired teachers. They didn't lay any off. They hired teachers. Mr. Speaker, I suppose we could have taken the approach that the former Liberal government took and just rolled all their wages back, but we decided not to do that.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, after instructing the school boards to make devastating cuts of $65 million to their budget in the last 2 years, the Minister of Education has decided she doesn't like what she sees. The government has decided to send a budget officer from the Department of Education to dictate where the cuts should be made. School boards are making gut-wrenching decisions to try and please the minister. If she didn't expect the results to be devastating as they are, then we have a very naive minister. My question to the minister is, in the past couple of days, we've heard the Premier call the school board names, insist they were playing games, and yesterday the minister threatened them. When the budget officer goes in, will he respect any of the school board's wishes, or will they just be doing the minister's bidding?
Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I made sure that Chignecto Regional School Board was receiving the support that they need to look over their budget to provide options. I recognize that letting go a complete service for library services in a complete board was unacceptable to this government.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Chignecto Central Regional Scoreboard has already been cut to the core. From their budget, 85% falls under wages and benefits. That leaves only 15% of the remaining budget to work with. They have already trimmed the fat. Positions have been cut. Which positions does the minister think are less important than the 41 librarians?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to remind the member opposite that we are dealing with declining enrollment and that we are providing the appropriate amount of funding based on the children in our school. Our per-child funding has gone up. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we heard from the Chignecto Regional School Board that because of declining enrollment, they would have to lose 18 teaching positions. People who work for Chignecto Regional are very nervous waiting for the minister's axe to fall. 58.1 members of the NSTU have their heads in the chopping block. 54.6 members of the NSGEU are nervously awaiting their pink slip. And 20.5 members of CUPE are shaking in their boots. Despite the outcry from the school board, the minister insists the cuts are not to affect the classroom. Now that the onus is on the minister, how does she plan to do this?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We are making sure that the resources that we're providing to our school boards match the needs of our students. Per capita funding has gone up, enrollment has gone down. There are 361 more teachers teaching today than there were 10 years ago, and 10 years ago we had 30,000 more students. We are making sure that our ratio stays low, it is low, and it is as low. For the last 3 years, it was 12.9, 12.9, 12.8. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Dexter government announced its intentions to block the Chignecto board's decision to eliminate librarians. The government's decision to step in and offer guidance came after weeks of gut-wrenching decisions making at the board level. After taking more than $60 million out of public education, the government's downloaded a lot of tough decisions, Mr. Speaker, to the board. For months, the only word from this government to the boards was that they'd be getting less money and more responsibility. So my question to the Premier, why did the Premier wait until yesterday to offer advice and support instead of offering it months ago?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, somebody has to stand up for the librarians and for the children, and we're happy to do that.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier may find this to be some game, Mr. Speaker. There are hard-working Nova Scotians who are accepting the responsibility that they were elected to do, and that is to deliver programs to students across this province. And to have a Premier download to them a budget, and when they respond to it, him not like it and interfere, Mr. Speaker, it's a simple question that he should be standing up and telling us. Why didn't he offer advice sooner instead of waiting to the 11th hour, Mr. Speaker? Chignecto board, Mr. Speaker, last night the Chignecto board said they welcome the advice from the government. They wish the offer had come sooner, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, but they also said offering advice with no additional money will mean cuts are still going to happen. So my question to the Premier, since you've made it clear that you won't provide additional funding, what programs will your government tell this board to cut?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what we're doing is trying to give them the assistance that they need in order to be able to get through their budget process so that they can make decisions that ensure that the money that we give them actually gets to the children, where the people it's supposed to benefit. That is the purpose of the advice that we're giving.
The official opposition on your final supplementary.
I don't know of a single elected school board member who runs for office who does not want to put the money that comes to them in front of children. I'm not exactly sure where the Premier comes from on that. Why is he insinuating that hard-working Nova Scotians who run for school board office are doing it for some other motive? Their motive is simple. Their motive is for students, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when you remove $60 million from public education, job cuts are unavoidable. Yet the Education Minister said, as more boards make budgetary decisions to cope with funding shortfalls, more jobs will not be cut. Mr. Speaker, how is that possible? We're asking boards to do more with less. Yesterday, the Halifax board announced that job cuts were likely coming. My question to the Premier. Premier waited to avoid. How will the Premier avoid the mistake he did with the Schnecto board, and what advice is he offering to the Halifax Regional School Board to make sure we're not faced with this crisis next week?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, in this province, we're going through changes in our education system. We have lost a considerable amount of students out of that system, some 30,000. Actually, the number's more now if you look at what's happened over the last 10 or 11 years. So what that means is that the money that we have has to be spent in a way that is responsible, and continuing to spend and just write a blank check is not a responsible thing to do. We have increased the per student funding. And for example, look at the Schenectady School Board, which has been the subject of the discussion. You know, their enrollment there dropped by 8%. Yeah, Mr. Speaker, their per student funding went up by 12%. Mr. Speaker, this is responsible decision making.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Education has slashed funding to education and has turned a blind eye to the negative impact that her cuts are having on our classrooms. Parents, students and community members and teachers are concerned about the impact this minister's cuts are having on public schools all across the province. The Nova Scotia Teachers Union, Mr. Speaker, represents over 10,000 teachers, members of the minister's own profession, I might add. The NSTU has a petition called Kids Not Cuts, calling on the NDP government to reinstate funding to public education. So my question to the minister, did she sign the petition?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. No.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To date, the petition now sits with more than 16,000 signatures. These signatures represent people who are worried about public education in the province. They represent people who are calling on the government to reverse the $65 million cuts. And, Mr. Speaker, as an educator, an MLA, and a concerned community member, I was proud to sign that petition, as were all members of the Liberal caucus. We were also proud, Mr. Speaker, to sign the petition and promote it through our communities. So my question, Mr. Speaker, to the minister is, how many of her NDP colleagues signed the Nova Scotia Teachers Union Kids Not Cuts petition?
Honourable the Minister of Education.
I did. I was a former teacher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have got to look at the reality of the situation that we're dealing with. We have less students in our schools. We cannot be maintaining teachers where there are no children.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on April the 5th, I read a resolution in this House calling on all members of the House to sign that petition, Kids Not Cuts. NDP caucus did not support that resolution, and we could hear many no's coming from that side of the House. So, Mr. Speaker, if the government supports students first, why did they not support the resolution and sign the petition, Kids Not Cuts?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. Everyone on this side, this government supports our students in our schools, and we have a plan. We have a plan called Kids and Learning First.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Premier. The government of New Brunswick inherited a real deficit of $722 million from the previous Liberal government when they were elected. Still, in their campaign, they had promised not to raise the HST there. And now, 2 years later, we know that they kept their promise. Mr. Speaker, our Premier made a similar promise to the people of Nova Scotia, despite the fact that he inherited a surplus. And I will table, for the benefit of the House, the message from the Minister for the year ended 2009, which states that there was a surplus of $19,700,000. But still, unlike the Premier of New Brunswick, the Premier of Nova Scotia broke his promise. So my question to the Premier, why is a promise from the Premier of New Brunswick worth more than a promise from the Premier of Nova Scotia?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what the provincial government did prior to 2009 is they took program spending and they built it on false revenues, and they built in escalators. That meant that in every year after they left government, there was going to be an accumulated deficit that would then be added to the debt. So they put in place a structural deficit that was going to cost the people of Nova Scotia $1.4 billion. Mr. Speaker, we had to pay that debt off in order to ensure that the people of Nova Scotia were not impoverished.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his second supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the only deficit that Premier has is a trust deficit. Whether it's in education, whether it's in health, whether it's in finance, that's the only true deficit over there, is a deficit of trust. In New Brunswick, rather than break their promise and hose taxpayers, they actually cut expenses at the top, at the centre of government, rather than their approach, which is to cut at the front lines of our classrooms and our hospitals. Mr. Speaker, the most recent headcount report of the Premier's own government, his own report on headcount, shows that at the department level,
Gary, you might learn something if you listen. Stop talking. Listen.
Keep repeating it, Gary. Read something for once, man. Just read something.
Mr. Speaker, the headcount report of the NDP's own government shows that the number of employees at the centre of government grew by a plus 42 last year, a number that is remarkably close to the 41 librarians that are being cut this week, as we know, at the Scotia Central School Board. So my question to the Premier is, why is it okay to cut at the front lines of our schools and hospitals and then add 42 new people at the centre of government, according to his own report, which I will table for the benefit of the House?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Speaker, that question went in a couple of different directions, so I'll try to address them. First of all, the governments of New Brunswick have chose over the last 4 years to add some $3.3 billion to their deficit. That's a or to their debt, rather. That's a choice, one that we have rejected. With respect to the number of employees, and I think he was specifically referring to education, I'll table for your information the estimate-to-estimate comparison that shows that the number of employees in the Department of Education have gone from 295 to 194 over the last 3 years.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The comparison to the province of New Brunswick is this. Their Premier kept his promise, and our Premier did not. That is a fact.
You know what the promise is.
And, Mr. Speaker, their Premier is staying true to his word that he is cutting 624 positions from the centre of government, as reported in the Halifax Herald today, and I will table that for the benefit of the House of Assembly, unlike our Premier's own headcount report, which shows agriculture at +10, economic and rural development at +21, finance at +12, labour and advanced education at +23. My question to the Premier, why do we have a do as I say, not a do as I do Premier? When will he take his own advice and start keeping his promises at the centre of government instead of imposing them on others?
Honourable the Premier.
I suppose that we have to assume as a result of that they would cut the public service to a much greater degree than we have. But the simple fact of the matter is that we have reduced the number of FTEs in provincial government by more than 400. I would point out to the Leader of the Conservative Party that as a result of the decisions made in New Brunswick, the net debt to GDP ratio in New Brunswick has increased, while the one in Nova Scotia has gone down. And in fact, New Brunswick will actually, I'll table this, will actually exceed ours sometime this year.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On March the 2nd, the Nova Scotia Teachers Union organized a Take Your MLA to School Day. This was an important opportunity for MLAs to see the realities of our public education system. Members were invited to see firsthand the complexities of our classroom. If members could not participate on that particular day, the NSTU was very accommodating in organizing alternate dates. So my question to the Minister, did she support the NSTU initiative?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I had the honour of being a classroom teacher for 30 years. My colleagues, and I know colleagues opposite, participated in the Take Your MLA to School Day, and from all the reports that I've heard, every single person had an absolutely well-received and informative time. So I thank all of the teachers that participated in Take Your MLA to Work, and unfortunately I did not participate, but after 30 years in the classroom, I think I have a pretty good idea what children's learning looks like.
The honourable member from Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also spent a fair number of years in the classroom, and I still felt I needed to go back to see what was going on today. Mr. Speaker, the needs of today's classroom are complex. Teachers are faced with a growing diversity of needs and fewer resources. Education assistance and supports for special needs students are being cut, and this is having a negative impact on all students and all teachers. The Nova Scotia Teachers Union Take Your MLA to School Day provided an opportunity for us in this House to see what teachers are dealing with on a daily basis. So my question to the Minister is, although she says she did not participate, why did she not participate?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, I have the opportunity in being many schools in the province of Nova Scotia. I feel that I'm in an absolutely wonderful profession now to be able to get into any school that I would like to see certain programs. I have watched virtual school. I have watched skills trades. I am in lots of schools all across the province, and unfortunately, I did not participate on the MLA Back to School Day because I was engaged in another meeting. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I did say, Mr. Speaker, I did say in my earlier question that the NSTU was very accommodating, and if an MLA had a commitment on that day, they could make an alternate arrangement. So I'm not sure that saying I had another meeting is a good enough excuse. Nova Scotia teachers. But, Mr. Speaker, we'll let the NSTU and the members of the teaching profession judge that. The Nova Scotia Teachers Union has organized two initiatives take your MLA to school, and Kids Not Cuts petition. And we've heard today, Mr. Speaker, that not only did the minister not participate, she has not openly said that she supports either one of those. So my question to the minister is this. What message does this minister have for the NSTU and all of the teachers in this province about her lack of participation, her lack of support in these two important initiatives?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know that the NSTU has a few initiatives going on, but you know this government has a very big initiative going on, and that's called Kids and Learning First. And part of that, we are working with the Nova Scotia Teachers Union to look at the life of a classroom teacher and how we can work together to make sure that they are providing the most effective service. I hear from teachers saying that there's too much paperwork. We're working on that together. So my initiative is Kids and Learning First.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Premier. In a Chronicle Herald opinion piece today, Leanne Hashie of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business explained that the business community needs a government that, I quote, is truly open to meaningful consultation in all areas of public policy, that its actions are in sync with its words. We need to know that the outcomes aren't foregone conclusions, and I'll table that quote for the benefit of the House. But we know that's not what happened with the most recent round on first contract arbitration, Mr. Speaker, because the government, as we find out now, had pre-cooked their preferred legislation long before the consultation ever began. My question to the Premier, in light of this evidence, will he now admit that the entire consultation was nothing but a sham?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What happened, which is normal practice in government, is materials come forward, draft legislation comes forward. The decision is then to send that out for consultation. You undergo a consultation stakeholder sessions in order to make sure you have all the input. Then all that material comes back. You decide on a final draft of legislation, and then it goes forward for introduction. That's what happens, as far as I know, in every case. Now, it may be that the former government did things differently. Perhaps it was their decision, to shoot first and ask questions later.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's very interesting, because in this House, on November 1st, 2011, the Premier said, and I quote from Hansard, "We talked about the Labour Management Review Committee. We said it was a good idea. We said we didn't want to see what happened in the past, where legislation was introduced without any consultation, without any vehicle for study. And yet now we know that the government had cooked up their bill long before they actually asked anyone's opinion. Then they cast aside the opinion of the CFIB. They cast aside the opinion of important employers like Michelin. They put them through a sham consultation. So my question to the Premier is, will he now apologize for putting all of those important employers throughout Nova Scotia through a false sham consultation?
That's right. Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what happened was exactly what I described in Hansard. I didn't know that I had said that in the past, but obviously I did, and that's exactly what happened. We had some draft legislation. We put it out through the LMRC to have consultations. They did. They came back. They reported back. They did not have specific recommendations, but they did provide us with the materials that they had received. Certainly, all of the interest groups in Nova Scotia had a full opportunity to examine the issue and to provide assistance and advice to the government.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Ms. Hashie of the CFIB told reporters recently all the time and resources and money we spent and our member employers spent was all for naught. It was clear the government knew what it wanted to do in advance, long before stakeholders were brought into the process. I hear the Premier's answer. The previous question is no, he won't apologize for causing them these very employers that took the Premier at his word, spent time and money and came to the legislature to express their opinion. If not today, when will he apologize to the employers of Nova Scotia for putting them through the ringer on his first contract arbitration sham process?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, of course, we greatly respect all of the members of our business community. We deal with them on a daily basis. We work with them on many great projects to the benefit of the province of Nova Scotia. We put in place a labour management review committee that was there for the purpose of consulting with them. That consultation took place in good faith, provided us with advice. We were then able to come back with what, in our judgment, was the right piece of legislation. That was a good bill. It's a good law. It makes for a more stable environment. It means that there will be an increase in productivity. Those things are all good for our economy.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, the government refuses to admit their $60 million in cuts will negatively impact the classrooms. Well, Alexis Allen, the NSTU president, said, quote, students will be affected by these cuts. There is no avoiding it. Our schools are being cut to the core, resulting in larger classes, fewer supports, less time for individual attention, and fewer courses to meet individual needs. And I'll table that, end quote. So, Mr. Speaker, would the Minister of Education please tell me, is the NSTU and Alexis Allen wrong?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It is my job in this province to stand up for students, and that is what I'm doing.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, the minister is throwing the students under the bus, is what she's doing. But, you know, Mr. Speaker, the education minister continues to insist that no jobs were lost because of the NDP's attack on public education. Despite her insistence, Liz Mcdonald, president of CUPE Local 5050, says, quote, having just gone through a difficult round of cuts at the end of last year in which we lost dozens and dozens of important frontline workers, parents need to become more informed and involved if we are to prevent further cuts, end quote, and I'll table that. So, Mr. Speaker, is Liz Mcdonald of CUPE wrong?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to remind the member that our ratio is the lowest it has been for the last 3 years, 12.9. We are investing appropriately for our students. Our per-student funding has gone up, and it is at the highest it has ever been in this province.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, if the ratios were as low as the minister suggested, she would not have had to raise the minimum class cap size this year. So we all know that she is misleading the House when she says that. Mr. Speaker, this government is robbing our students of essential services. The Education Minister refuses to acknowledge this fact and just offers the talking points from the Premier's office, which, when you look at the numbers that they provide, they don't even reflect what the minister herself is saying. NSGU disagrees with the government too. President Joan Jessom says, quote, the province is basing its cuts to school boards.
Order, please. The honourable member for Dartmouth East has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. President Joan Jessom says, quote, the province is basing its cuts to school boards on declining enrollments, but fewer students do not mean fewer needs. Educational assistants, administrative assistants, and librarians need to be there when the students need them, end quote, Mr. Speaker. And furthermore, we all know that the 1-point-something students per school that her own department said has declined by doesn't reduce the heating costs, the busing costs, or any of those other fixed costs. So, Mr. Speaker, is Joan Jessom wrong?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. When we provided the budget line for each of the school boards, we took into consideration fixed costs. We have not. There is declining enrollment in the province, and we made sure that the resources match the declining enrollment, and also taking into consideration the fixed costs that school boards have. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Argyle.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As we all know, contract talks between the Capital District Health Authority and the NSGU have broken down, and we're less than 2 weeks away from a potential strike by 3,600 healthcare support workers. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's quite clear from the history that the NDP have a very close tie with big labour groups like the NSGU. In 2010, the NDP were fined by Alexis, Nova Scotia, because they failed to return $45,000 from 8 unions and 1 affiliate. In 2006, the NSGU president used the union mailing list to endorse the NDP candidate in Halifax Clayton Park. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier: how can patients trust the NDP government not to favour its Labour union friends who helped them get elected over patients' health care priorities?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I mean that preamble that was filled with so many accusations and falsehoods. I couldn't keep track of them all. But, Mr. Speaker, the simple fact of the matter is that there is a collective bargaining process. It is a difficult one. The parties have tried to reach an agreement. They are now into a countdown. The gravity of this situation is very high, and I think that what we need to understand is that over the coming 10 days there will be the necessity for these parties to get back to the table and to try to find a resolution that provides the appropriate service to their patients and, of course, protects public health care in this district.
Order, please. The word falsehood is unparliamentary, so I would ask the honourable member if he'd please retract the word falsehood in his statement, please.
Mr. Speaker, I understand that you can say it, you just can't do it. Is that the idea? Or no, it's the other way around. You can do it, you just can't say it. So, Mr. Speaker, I retract it.
Okay. The honourable member for Argyle.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, I think he challenged the Speaker there. I thought that was pretty impressive. Thinks he's smarter than everybody else, because that continues to happen in many, many places. We're kind of learning to expect that of the Premier of Nova Scotia. The Premier didn't stand up for the people who relied on Metro Transit bus service for their life essentials. The public questioned why they should believe that he would stand up against his union friends in healthcare. Are all the potential options to protect the patients, including back-to-work legislation, truly on the table for this NDP Premier in the event of a strike by healthcare workers and the Capital District Health Authority?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think we well know the opinions of the Conservative Party on this matter. We know that they have always chosen the options that most infringe upon collective bargaining rights. We know that they are opposed to good faith bargaining, that they want to have only their way when it comes to the administration of health care. They don't want to listen to frontline health care workers, and we experienced this. We experienced it through Bill 68. And you'll remember Bill 68. That was when they wanted to impose a contract, take away the right for people to even meet to discuss a contract. And I remember the health care workers, Mr. Speaker. I remember the health care workers. They said to us, Mr. Speaker, that Bill 68 was the worst thing that ever happened to them since the Liberals rolled their wages back.
The honourable member for Argyle in his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I like listening to the piece of fiction coming from the Premier here. The employer is well represented The employees are well represented, but I can tell you that patients have no representation with this NDP Premier because of his ties with union bosses of this province. Nova Scotia have the right to know what their elected officials will do to ensure that they have access to health care services that they deserve as a right. Is the Premier going to tell his union boss friends to stand in the way of his responsibility to protect patient care, or will he do the right thing? Will he actually do the right thing this time? Because doing the right thing seems to be very hard for this Premier to get the two groups back to the table. Will they go back to the table?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, you can be assured that we stand ready to assist the parties in any way that we can to facilitate an agreement, Mr. Speaker. And of course, we're paying very close attention to this because we want to ensure that patients in this district get the services that they need. And we understand that this is a difficult process. And of course, it's much easier for a majority government just to bring in legislation and to slam the door on any possibility of a good faith agreement. But we have chosen not to do that, Mr. Speaker. We are allowing the process to take its course, and we expect that reasonable people can come to a reasonable agreement.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, every parent sending their children to school in the fall experiences stress. The stress for parents of young diabetic children increases exponentially, as they must also ensure there are adequate supports in place to protect their children's health and well-being. While the Minister of Education has developed a policy for type 1 diabetics in the classroom to ensure these children are able to enjoy a quality education despite their chronic illness, the policy requires additional supports to be effective. Given this NDP government has cut $60 million out of public education, how will the minister ensure we won't have a situation similar to last September's, where parents are forced to remove young diabetic children from the classroom due to lack of support?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Every child that comes to school is supported appropriately, and in some cases we need to have a little bit of extra help with the team associated with each child. Every child's situation with diabetes is a little bit different. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, educational assistants in many boards support children with diabetes. Job losses for EAs does not make the needs of young children with diabetes go away. In fact, it makes the management of the disease that much more challenging. If educational assistants are stretched too thin and teachers in the classroom are left with inadequate supports, they may miss triggers in diabetics that suddenly present themselves, especially in very young children who do not fully understand the disease. How will the minister ensure her type 1 diabetes policy can be followed when boards are reducing the number of EAs as a result of NDP budget cuts?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The health and safety of every child is paramount to every teacher in this province. When a child comes to school with any form of specific needs, a need that needs to have support, then the parent and the teacher and the school work together to have a plan. So each case is different, and each child is supported. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, all week we have heard the minister justify massive cuts to education under the guise of declining enrollment. So here's a little fact for the minister. The incidence of juvenile type 1 diabetes is rising across the country at a rate of 5% a year, the greatest prevalence rate being in children 5 to 9. Minister can continue to live in a fairy tale world she wants, but the challenges associated with ensuring young children with type 1 diabetes in the classroom have the necessary supports are unfortunately not declining. In fact, they are increasing. Given budget cuts to education, will the minister reassure parents of young diabetics that ongoing adequate support will be available for their children this September, yes or no?
Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I can answer that with confidence. We will have supports for children that need support. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings West on a new question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, Nova Scotians heard of the potential impacts of a strike at Capital Health, with 9,000 people currently on the wait list for surgery and the potential for cancellation of 104 surgeries a day. Waits will only get worse. This district not only provides healthcare services to the residents of the district, it is a pivotal site for the delivery of healthcare to residents throughout the province. My question to the Minister of Health and Wellness: when will this minister urge both parties to get back to the bargaining table so an agreement can be reached prior to midnight, April 25th?
Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for that very important question. Mr. Speaker, I and the Premier have both been certainly encouraging that very thing to occur.
The honourable member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, patients are being moved now. Cancellations, if they aren't already occurring, will be very soon. This is a government that boasts at every chance that they are improving emergency room care, that they have improved wait times, and yet patients and potential patients continue to wait, wondering whether this government plans to act or sit on the sideline. My question to the minister: how long will patients have to be inconvenienced before this minister decides to take action to avert a probable strike?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think most members here would be aware that yesterday Capital District held a press conference, and they've been communicating with the public to allow the public to have a better understanding of what the current situation is and how the process will unfold in this very important period. But, Mr. Speaker, as the Premier said yesterday and again today, the best place to have a resolution is at the bargaining table, and we would encourage the parties to return to the bargaining table to find a solution. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Residents of Capital District will experience longer wait times. Nova Scotians will experience longer wait times. Potential strike within Capital Health will bring everything to a grinding halt quickly, causing disruptions throughout the entire healthcare system. Can the minister please indicate whether it is her government's plan to send this issue to binding arbitration, just like she did for the nurses at Capital Health?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Capital District Health Authority had an opportunity to outline the various processes that they will undergo during this period. And Mr. Speaker, once again, we encourage the people settle their differences at the bargaining table. I want to assure people that the health and safety of residents of this province, and indeed other provinces, because this, the QE in particular, does provide services to residents of other provinces, are of the utmost of concern for myself and the Premier and this government. Mr. Speaker, my deputy has been in contact with other provinces, and we will continue to work very hard to support the parties in reaching a settlement. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Community Services. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the Ministers of Community Services and Justice were asked very specific questions by my colleagues, and I'm going to table those. Those questions were about what they and their departments knew about the daycare in East Preston. Mr. Speaker, as members of this House and as parents and as grandparents, our first priority should be the safety and well-being of our children. Many times today we heard the Minister of Education saying the safety of children was a priority. This Minister of Community Service did nothing for over 7 months to notify the parents or the current board about the situation. This minister gave no information to this House. She has stuck to her talking points, and she has covered up the truth about what's going on? Will the minister commit to table specific, detailed answers to the questions that were put to her by noon tomorrow?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, I have been absolutely clear. I have given the facts. Number one, children is of great concern, any issues surrounding children and their parents. We do that every day in community services. That is what we've dedicated ourselves to. I've also been very clear on the fact that I tabled 3 articles that clearly stated that the daycare knew about the allegations for well over 10 years. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table for the Registry of Joint Stock Companies the list of the Board of Directors of the East Preston Daycare, which have changed at least 6 times in the last 10 years. So, Mr. Speaker, it is the current board that this minister failed to communicate with. This minister will not tell the House what she did. This minister will not tell us when she learned about the full seriousness of this problem. This minister has said what has she meant by the word we did an internal investigation? This minister hasn't told us why we needed an internal investigation. This minister didn't say whether there was any consideration of the impact on the province's defence of lawsuits if they warned anybody about what was taking place in East Preston. Mr. Speaker, for the sake of the children, this minister should have erred on the side of caution and told the current board what was going on. Parents of these kids deserve answers, Mr. Speaker. What is the minister covering up? What makes her duck every question? What is it that she's covering up?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite and his party does not understand the role of community services and the role of the RCMP. The role of the RCMP is to investigate.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Community Services has the floor.
The role of the RCMP.
Order, please. I'm not going to repeat myself continuously when I call order. When I say order, I'd like to see order in the chamber so we can have a relatively calm parliamentary debate. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Community Services.
The role of the RCMP, Mr. Speaker, is to investigate historical allegations. These allegations are over 40 years old. The role of the community services is to investigate any current allegations, and as I have said in this House over and over, we followed the same protocol as that party would to investigate any current allegations.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, nobody has questioned what the role of the RCMP is, but I do know that we would have called the Board of Directors of East Preston and made sure that we erred on the side of caution for the safety of the children that are there. Mr. Speaker, my final supplementary is to the Minister of Justice. With the Minister of Justice, who didn't give any answers as well yesterday, he wouldn't Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order. Pardon me? Pardon me? Do not flaunt the chair. Do not. When I say order, I mean order in this chamber. So please, respect the rules of the Canadian parliamentary system. When the Speaker says order, that means order. So now we'll continue with the question by the, was it the answer? By the Minister of Justice was for the Minister of Justice? Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Justice. You didn't ask it yet? Go ahead. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate your calmness in the chair today.
Thank you.
My question is to the Minister of Justice. The Minister of Justice, when he was asked the questions yesterday by my colleague from Inverness, wouldn't give answers of what he knew, when he knew it, or what he did about what he learned. My question to the Minister of Justice, will he commit to answering the questions we're tabled here in the House today by noon tomorrow?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to assure the House that this Minister of Justice, that this government is committed and focused on the safety of all Nova Scotians, whether they're children or adults. Unequivocally, there is no question in my mind of that commitment, and I spent a lifetime fulfilling that. I also want to reiterate in regards to the question being asked that in relation to the answers that I've heard in the House, that I have the utmost respect and confidence, and I clearly understand the Minister of Social Services and what she's conveyed. And I concur 100% with her actions and with her answers, and I'm appalled that you can't comprehend that.
The Honourable Member for Preston.
Mr. Speaker, it's been a year since this NDP government broke a promise to municipalities and tore up the MOU service agreement. The MOU included an agreement where the province would gradually assume more responsibility in education funding. My question is to the Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations. Knowing that there would be a $65 million in NDP education cuts, why did the minister further jeopardize education by breaking the MOU last year?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the member opposite. That member, if his memory is good enough, would recognize that he was part of the Liberal government and a cabinet minister, part of the Liberal government that actually put the service exchange in place that actually imposed those education costs on municipal units. That's the system that we inherited. It was a cost-neutral system. In other words, municipalities were...
Order, please. Order, please. I hear it on order, please. I hear it on all sides of the House, all day today. It's on all sides of the House today. It's not just on one side of the House, okay? Well, it's very difficult in here. The time allotted for question period has expired, so I'll ask the honourable member to sit down, please. Oh, 3 minutes? I said 47. Oh, it's becoming, I want the members to actually sit down. It's becoming very heated in the chamber today. So I'd ask the members to take a deep breath so we can continue to debate in the chamber in a very good parliamentary way. So I asked all the members in here to do that today for the remainder of question period for today. And think about it over the weekend if you want to have good parliamentary debate in the chamber without chirping back and forth on all sides of the House. The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The situation that municipalities find themselves in on the costs that they have incurred from 15 years ago under a previous Liberal government was a mechanism that was determined to be cost neutral for them. They probably don't agree with having any costs imposed on them, but these are not costs that were imposed by this government, Mr. Speaker, and they do carry a share, and the member opposite will remember his comments last year saying this would cause an increase in taxes. Matter of fact, taxes rates have gone down in the HRM and basically across the province, so we're quite pleased with the result.
The honourable member for Preston.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I was here in 1993 when the province was broke, and a service exchange was put in place, and this minister and this government broke an MOU that was negotiated with the provinces, with the municipalities. And I believe that they have to ensure that the municipalities will have to shoulder more increased cost, and that is what we're hearing from the municipalities. That NDP government has cut $65 million from schools. At the same time, they have downloaded an increase in educational cost on the municipalities. Has the minister considered revisiting his decision on mandatory contributions to municipalities regarding education?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
We're not reconsidering that, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Preston on his final supplementary.
It is clear that in case of the province downloading responsibility onto the municipalities, and indeed there will be higher taxes in time to come as a result of the cancellation of this MOU. The minister has turned his back on the MOU last year, and now the NDP is imposing $65 million in cuts. The double hit to education from the NDP, and it's a further strain.
Order, please. One of those days. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. Can I finish what I'm saying? Thank you. Thank you. Oral questions put by members, the time has expired, so I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on a point of order regarding an exchange between myself and the Premier during question period today. The forecast increase in net debt for the province of Nova Scotia for the year just ended is $462.9 million.
That's not a point of order.
Premier stated in his answer.
It's not a point of order. It's a difference between two members. It's not a point of order.
I'm referring to.
It's not a point of order. It's a difference between two members in the chamber.
That went up.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, during question period, the member for Lunenburg West was clearly heard by members on this side of the House as using what is deemed very unparliamentary language towards members of our caucus. I would ask that you have the member, rather than repeat the words, I would hope that the member would take the opportunity to retract the comments he was making that was clearly heard from our side, our caucus, and the Conservative caucus as well.
Well, so much noise in here today, it's hard to hear, but I will check with Hansard and ask them to have a look into it, and I will, I will check with Hansard first. No, I'm not. I will check with Hansard first. Point of order. Point of order. The Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much. And I don't want to beleaguer this one too much longer, but we heard it very clearly as well from the member from Lunenburg West. So you do have a whole bunch of people that did hear something blurred out over there that probably shouldn't have came.
Yeah. I will take that under advisement, and I will have a look and report back to the House at the earliest convenience. But I will check with Hansard and the recording and the Ledge television to see if there's anything recorded. Thank you. The Honourable Government House Leader.
We should now leave the chair and the House. This House resolve itself in the whole House on supply.
We will now take a short break as we will go into. We'll now go into supply, and I will recognize the Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to have the